They thought she was crocheting her boredom away, just another bored desk body counting hours until shift change. But that was before the night the comm spoke her name in a tone that didn't belong to this base, or this chain of command. And before we even get into how everything unraveled from there, if you believe quiet doesn't mean harmless, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the only one holding the line, make sure to like and subscribe, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a reminder. Now, most people on Bravo Outpost 9 couldn't have told you the name of the woman in the far left watch chair if you paid them. They knew her as Bliss, sometimes the quiet one, sometimes knitting girl, depending on which brand of arrogance was passing through the room that day. Her full name, Sergeant Marin Bliss, rarely left anyone's lips except on the roster. 28 years old, lean, soft-voiced, calm in that way that made cocky people uncomfortable. She kept her hair pulled back tight, wore her uniform regulation perfect, and carried herself with the kind of unbothered stillness that didn't fit the chaos of the auxiliary watch floor. And every night, somewhere between the 1900 equipment check and the midnight drone sweep, she'd reach into her pack and pull out a half-finished scarf the color of deep forest moss, roll it delicately over her knees, and pick up where she left off, 2 needles, a ball of yarn, and hands that moved with patient rhythm. The others saw a hobby, a distraction, something unserious. They didn't know what they were looking at, but they sure thought they did. The watch floor wasn't glamorous. It was a converted observation deck with buzzing lights that flickered just enough to annoy, but never enough to get replaced, and reinforced windows looking out over the dark stretch of coastline where they swore nothing ever happened. Coastal winds rattled the metal frames just enough to make rookies glance up now and then, but veterans of boredom stopped hearing it. There were 6 screens mounted in a staggered row, each divided into quadrants: infrared, standard, motion scan, and topographical overlays tracking the hills, beach, and service docks. Most shifts ran quiet. A few fishing boats, unauthorized campers trying to sneak a view of the restricted shoreline, 2 drunk Marines, once who tried to take selfies near the fence. That was the level of excitement they were used to. So when Bliss took her post each evening, sliding into her chair in silence, a thermos of black coffee at her elbow, and that slow-growing scarf in her lap, the others barely clocked the fact that her eyes still scanned every feed while her fingers moved. They called it the library corner when she was there. That was Private Jameson's joke. Jameson with the loud voice and short attention span, always shoving his boots up on the panel until someone out-trinked him into putting them back down. He'd nudge the others and nod toward Marin's steady movements. "Grandma Watch has us covered," he'd mutter, and they'd snicker because group cowardice always sounds louder in a quiet room. Corporal Leary, who'd been on the outpost 3 months and already spoke like he'd earned a retirement pension, made a game out of guessing what kind of scarf it would be. "Maybe she's knitting it for her cat," he once said, loud enough for half the watch floor to hear. She didn't blink, didn't give them so much as a breath of acknowledgement. Just turned a stitch and reset the thermal panel's refresh rate with her free hand. See, that was the thing no one noticed. Not really. She never missed a flicker on a screen. She never lost count of the shoreline pings. She could recite every call sign tapping into their grid before the operator finished hailing. But quiet competence doesn't trend well in rooms full of people who inflate their own usefulness just to hear the echo. And because she never bragged, never barked, never performed, they drew the easiest conclusion the insecure always reach for. If she wasn't trying to impress them, she must not be impressive. The young ones watched her and saw softness. The older ones glanced at her file once and assumed whatever she'd done to earn sergeant strikes this early must have been administrative. Not one of them thought to ask why command never questioned her post rotations, or why she never pulled gate checks or meal runs like the others. Not one of them considered why her clearance tag on her console carried a secondary encryption signature no one else on that floor had. They saw yarn. They didn't see the bars. Around 2100, there'd usually be a lull. People leaned back in their chairs, scrolling through restricted apps under the desk or trading stories about barracks drama. The faint smell of reheated noodles or stale beef sticks hung in the recycled air. The heating system clicked every so often, uneven and struggling. That was when Jameson liked to throw glances her way, testing new jokes on Leary to see which got the best laugh. They'd whisper things like, "She probably got sent here because she messed up somewhere else," or Bet she has a TikTok for yarn tips. More than once, someone offered her a snack with a smirk, like they were extending charity. She always declined with the same quiet nod, never breaking rhythm, never pausing her scan. It wasn't submission. It wasn't shyness. It was something else entirely, something no one suspected until the night the comms snapped them all awake. That evening started like any other. The sun had dipped behind the western ridge, leaving only a wash of violet and orange cutting low over the water before darkness swallowed it. Floodlights along the perimeter cast bleached cones over the fencing, catching swirls of sand lifted by the wind. Inside, monitors glowed faint blue across the faces hunched in front of them. Two techs debated football traits. Someone in the back snored softly into his elbow before snapping awake at a dropped pen. Bliss counted stitches and glanced at feed delta every few seconds, tapping the audio sweep toggle with a knuckle. Every once in a while, she'd pause long enough to check the time without looking at a watch, like her body just knew where the hour was. They didn't know that she'd spent the first 3 years of her service not behind monitors, but behind enemy lines, embedded liaison on reconnaissance missions that never made the official logbooks. They didn't know she'd spent 2 weeks in Sangora Ridge with a fractured radio, 3 wounded allies under her command, and a naval extraction 2 valleys out that she orchestrated with hand signals and Morse bursts tapped through a broken transceiver. They didn't know she'd held the line on a hillside while counterfire raked the dirt 2 inches from her cheek, or that she'd kept 3 men alive with nothing but her vest kit, a shard of glass, and a jug of contaminated water she boiled over a signal flare. They didn't know, or maybe worse, they didn't care to consider, why her personnel jacket had half its pages redacted and why her promotion orders came with no ceremony. Just a sealed envelope and a directive to report to Outpost 9 immediately. Yarn made more sense to them than war. And that was fine with her. She didn't knit to pass time. She knit because her hands remembered shaking the first winter home, because sleep didn't come easy to people who'd spent nights listening for footsteps in the brush, because motion without panic was something she had to relearn. The scarf was discipline as much as therapy. Every row was a breath she didn't have to fight for. They thought she was bored. But she was calibrating herself, the room, the air, the silence between sounds. So when the whisper finally slipped through the comm line, low and unmistakable, it wasn't luck that made her hear it first. It was inevitability. But that moment, that sharp intake of breath from every seat behind her when Control spoke her name like a password, they didn't see it coming. Because no one ever expects the quiet one to be the reason the lights are still on. It began with a sound so subtle half the room thought they imagined it. The soft click of an encrypted channel forcing itself onto their network, overriding the routine audio feed, with a tone no one on that floor had ever heard in real time. Heads lifted slowly at first, then all at once when the voice came through, low, precise, and carrying the kind of authority that didn't bother explaining itself. Control to Sergeant Bliss. Eyes on Delta, channel open. Authentication. Halcyon 7. Jameson's chair squeaked as he sat up. Leary's gum froze mid-chew. The 2 techs by the auxiliary console glanced at each other, trying to place the voice or the clearance tag, but their expressions made it obvious. They'd never heard either. Marin didn't flinch. She didn't drop the needles, or gasp, or look around the room for approval. She set the scarf gently onto her lap, reached up, and pressed a barely visible finger tab beneath the left side of her headset. Bliss, she said, calm as the tide. Channel confirmed. Scanning Delta Sector. Stand by for thermal overlay. The console in front of her woke with a deeper, darker interface, one none of them recognized. Panels that were usually static flickered with new tracking grids, sectors labeled not by numbers, but call signs they'd never trained on. One of the night lieutenants, Morales, stepped forward like he was going to intervene, but the system denied him access before he could spit out a question. His keypad lit red and flashed a message he couldn't override. Restricted. S3 clearance, or above only. Morales wasn't S3. Neither was anyone else in that room. The temperature in the watch floor seemed to change without actually shifting. Even the hum of the equipment felt different, as though the building itself understood who had just taken command. Bliss adjusted a single dial and 3 monitors inverted to infrared, the coastline bleeding into gradients of white and black. Someone in the back whispered, "What is Halcyon 7?" But no one answered because no one knew. Then another voice came through the channel, different from the first. Older, clipped, the kind of tone carved by decades of giving orders no one argued with. Delta Quadrant shows intermittent signatures north by 5. Possible crawl approach or thermal shielded insertion. Confirm your eyes on. Bliss narrowed her focus, but didn't raise her voice. Visual now. Movement registering low profile, coastline brush, 60 meters inside marker stone. 2 heat drifts. Possibly free. Wind masking residual. She slid one of the monitors into a tight zoom with a swipe of her wrist, and for the first time, everyone else in the room truly looked at the screen instead of at her hands. A few of them squinted, trying to decide if the flickers of movement were real or artifact. She didn't hesitate. Recommend silent intercept. No alarms. No floodlight trigger. Advise standby team on ridge path access route. Control answered instantly, like they'd just been waiting for her call. Copy Bliss. Ridge team mobilizing. Your discretion on timing. Morales tried again, stepping closer. Sergeant. What? She didn't look at him. Sir, step back from the console, she said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that stopped him mid-word. Not because she was loud, but because the room suddenly understood she spoke with authority none of them had been briefed on. She tapped another code into the panel, and the side screen lit with a silent beacon relay. Tiny dots began to move in formation from the south perimeter. A response team already in motion before most of the watchers even processed there was something to respond to. Jameson muttered, not quite under his breath. Holy, how is she doing that? Nobody bothered to hush him. The ones who'd laughed at her swallowed their words so fast it was painful to watch. Even the ones who'd stayed neutral sat paralyzed, caught between disbelief and the slow dawning realization that whatever they thought they knew about Sergeant Marin Bliss had just been rewritten in one transmission. The scarf lay untouched on her lap, yarn pooled like ivy across her knee, but the woman who'd been holding the needles a moment earlier was gone, replaced by someone none of them had taken the time to see. And as the movement on the screen resolved into clearer shapes, and the silent intercept closed in undercover of darkness, not one person on that floor dared to speak her name out loud. They didn't need to. The comms already had. The moment the intercept team broke formation and vanished into the dark brush beyond the perimeter, the atmosphere inside the watch floor changed in a way that couldn't be undone, even if everyone tried to pretend nothing had happened. The monitors began populating quiet status reports in green text, silent pings showing the ridge team sweeping in a perfect arc around the coastline's blind spots, moving like a practiced hand wiping clean the edge of a map. No one dared to speak above a breath, and even those breaths were shallow, like volume itself might trigger something they had no right to touch. Sergeant Marin Bliss kept her hands poised over the console, headset angled low beneath her hairline, eyes moving with the same deliberate stillness she'd had before the channel opened. Except now, every soul in that room finally comprehended that her silence hadn't been the mark of someone who didn't belong. It had been the warning of someone operating far above their understanding. When the secondary comm line buzzed with that clipped tone signaling contact confirmation, it was followed by a voice quieter this time. Maybe because the threat was contained, or maybe because even Control knew the walls were listening. 3 individuals in custody. No injuries. No signals sent. Ridge team moving to extraction point, North Dock. One of the techs, Stevens, who'd spent the last hour pretending he was too busy to mock her, blinked like he'd accidentally stepped into a briefing he wasn't cleared for and slowly backed into his chair. Morales stayed standing, but the way his hands had quietly folded behind his back suggested his posture was no longer about authority, but apology dressed as professionalism. Bliss responded without theatrics. Copy. Confirm dock is secure and signal med transport for detainee evaluation on arrival. Maintain dark route. She didn't ask who the infiltrators were. She didn't speculate, and she didn't turn to see whether anyone behind her was breathing yet. Control replied with a short acknowledgement. Agreed. Medical on board. Transport in 10. Stand by for debrief window. After that, the encrypted channel faded with a clean click, leaving behind an absence so loud it seemed to vibrate against the reinforced glass. For a long beat, no one moved. The scarf lay folded on the corner of her console now, a dark green coil that felt, to everyone watching, like a loaded sidearm disguised as yarn. Jameson, who'd once joked about her knitting for a cat, stared at it like it might testify against him in a court-martial. Leary swallowed so hard his throat clicked. Someone farther back muttered something that sounded like Jesus, but even that came out like a confession rather than a word. Bliss scanned the screens one more time before removing just the outer layer of her earpiece, not the intercom unit, which none of them had even realized she was wearing. The distinction wasn't lost on the few who'd been paying close enough attention. Then, in a tone that was neither cold nor warm, merely resolved, she said, "Return to standard sector monitoring. Delta remains priority focus until doc reports clean." It wasn't barked, and it didn't need to be. People moved because leadership often whispers before it ever needs to shout. Morales, who was technically the senior shift supervisor on paper, stepped forward again, but slower this time, his voice pitched low. "Sergeant, if command reaches out to me for any reason." She finally turned her head, not dramatically, not aggressively, just enough that her eyes met his. "They won't," she said. And there was something about the certainty in her voice that told every person listening that if control intended to involve anyone else, it would have happened long before now. "Your logs will show routine patrol dispatch and perimeter reinforcement. Anything above that is not yours to field." Morales nodded and backed away without argument. No one mocked her then. No one shifted their weight like she was overstepping. They'd crossed a threshold where the hierarchy they thought they knew had been quietly inverted by truth. It took 19 minutes for the Ridge team to reach the North Dock, and in those 19 minutes, the watch floor existed in a kind of suspended silence. Screens updated. Perimeter sensors blinked. Someone coughed once and immediately apologized to no one in particular. Bliss didn't pick up her needles yet. She tapped her knuckle once against the console, listening for a synced tone only she could hear. After a quiet exchange on a private band, she murmured something too low for the rest of them to make out, then leaned back in her chair with the kind of controlled exhale that spoke of decades of discipline compressed into a 28-year-old spine. When the outer speakers crackled again, it wasn't control, it was Doc's security, frantic and confused. Dispatch? We've got unidentified operatives offloading 3 restrained persons at Dock 6. They're not using standard transport, and Then another voice interrupted, snapping crisp and controlled over his hesitation. Dock 6, stand down. Custody measures authorized under Directive Blackwire. All receiving personnel vacate the immediate area unless individually cleared under classification S3 or above. Confirm compliance. The dock guard stammered. "Who is?" But Bliss flipped a toggle and cut the feed on their end, sparing the room the embarrassment of listening to someone get verbally stepped on by a command miles above their pay grade. She turned to Morales, "Just once. You'll need to annotate perimeter logs for Drone Alpha and physical team deployment. Keep it vague." He nodded, not because he wanted to, but because saying otherwise now felt like trying to argue with gravity. 10 minutes later, the side entrance to the watch floor hissed open, the one only used by personnel moving between secure comms bays and classified logistics. No one ever came through that door during night rotation. Yet there he stood. Colonel Reese Alden, the stiff-backed specter half the base whispered about, but rarely saw outside briefing rooms. Tall, silver at the temples, eyes that belonged to someone who'd read too many casualty reports and taken each one personally, even when he didn't show it. The air changed again. 3 people stood so quickly they nearly tripped over themselves. Morales snapped to attention so fast his chair rolled into a wall. Jameson's mouth opened, then closed, like his brain had canceled speech mid-launch. Alden didn't look at any of them. His eyes landed on Bliss like the rest of the room was just furniture someone hadn't moved out of the way yet. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand an explanation. He simply said 6 words that froze the blood of every witness. "Sergeant Bliss. With me. Situation brief." Not a request. Not a courtesy. An order spoken like 2 people who'd done this before. She rose without hesitation, headset still in place, scarf still untouched on the console. As she passed the others, no one tried to stop her with questions or apologies or attempts at small talk. But they watched, wide-eyed, as Alden stepped aside just enough to let her exit first. He followed, doors shutting behind them with a soft hydraulic hiss. The room stayed frozen for 3 long seconds until Leary whispered, voice barely holding steady. Did a colonel just? And Jameson, eyes pinned to the empty space where she'd stood, finished for him in a strict whisper. Follow her out like she outranked him. No one corrected him. Outside the observation floor, the hallway lights dimmed to night protocol as Alden and Bliss walked side by side down the steel-lined corridor leading to the secure comm bay. They didn't speak until they reached the reinforced door where 2 MPs stood guard. Alden keyed in his credentials, but Bliss placed her palm on the scanner beside his without needing to be told. The MP on the left tried not to look surprised when the lock disengaged at her touch. Inside the dim blue-lit briefing room, Alden closed the door and faced her fully. His voice dropped a register. Less command now and more quiet acknowledgement. Freeman probe team. Not amateurs. Likely testing response time. Could have been worse without your eyes on Delta. She didn't respond with false humility or self-defense. She simply stated the facts. Perimeter's been too quiet the last month. They were waiting for rotation fatigue. Alden nodded once. Extraction team will hold them at Fort Shore until intel confirms intent. I'll be filing your after-action under classified operations, same as before. He paused, studying her. You know the watch floor's never going to see you the same way again. She met his gaze steadily. I didn't take the post to be seen. That answer made something in his expression shift, almost a smirk, almost pride, but contained like everything else about the man. You'll be getting a transfer request again after this, he said evenly. Command's been waiting for an excuse to pull you back up chain. Her jaw moved slightly, a muscle ticking near her ear. I'll go where I'm sent. Then, quieter, but the outpost still has holes. If I leave now, the next breach might not be a probe. Alden absorbed that. He knew better than most what it cost people like her to keep choosing posts beneath their clearance level just to make sure someone was actually watching. After a long pause, he said simply, I'll stall the transfer. 2 months at most. Then you and I are having a different conversation. She didn't argue, which he understood as consent in her language. With that, he turned toward the console to send his encrypted field report. She stepped back toward the door, not dismissing herself, but allowing him privacy like she'd done a dozen times before in scenarios no one in that watch room would ever read about in any briefing. When she returned, the room startled like they'd been caught doing something wrong, even though they'd barely moved. She walked past them, set her headset gently onto its cradle, and reclaimed her seat. The scarf came back into her hands like it had been waiting for her return. She found her last stitch, looped the yarn, and resumed the rhythm that had fooled them all, except now they watched with a reverence their earlier mockery didn't deserve. Jameson opened his mouth, then closed it. Leary tried to speak, failed, then managed, barely audible. Sergeant, if you ever need, but she didn't make him finish. She didn't need his sentence or his guilt. She just kept knitting. Not to erase the night, but to anchor it. Outside the windows, the coastline lay quiet again, waves erasing footprints no one would ever know were there. Inside, every inch of the watch floor had been rearranged without a single piece of furniture moving. And even though no metal would be pinned, no announcement made, and no report shared with the ones who'd mocked her, something larger than apologies settled over the room. The understanding that the only reason the alarms hadn't gone off tonight was because the person they'd been laughing at had never needed their permission to save them.